New Dodge City, 1878. The chapel doors groan open and a hush falls like dust on polished boots. An 18-year-old bride in plain ivory lifts her chin. Beside her stands the oldest, richest rancher in Ford County, stone-faced, unreadable. The town whispers purchase, the organ sighs duty, but in the candlelit shadows a secret stirs, ready to unmake every vow. Is this a bargain sealed in fear, or the beginning of a love neither dared imagine? When night falls, the past will knock, and one choice between survival and desire will change everything. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from. And one question: what do you most crave in a period romance? Dodge City, Kansas, spring of 1878. The air smelled of dust and lilacs, an odd perfume of life and grit clinging to the wooden bones of a town carved from prairie and pride. It was a place where reputations bloomed fast and rotted faster, where every whispered word could carry through the clapboard walls and reach the other end of Front Street before the sun had set. Clara Whitmore stood at the threshold of the small ranch chapel, her gloved hands trembling just slightly as they clutched the faded bouquet of prairie lilies tied with a strip of cotton. Her ivory muslin dress, though modest, caught the sunlight streaming through the warped stained glass window and glowed with a ghost of elegance. The lace along the collar had once belonged to her mother's veil. The bustle was small, the sleeves were plain, and she wore no corset beneath. There had been no time, no money, and no need. She was 18, newly orphaned, and about to become the wife of a man nearly half a century older than herself. Jedediah Carter, 66 years of dust, sun, and stubborn silence, stood beside her at the altar. His dark frock coat was well pressed, but bore the unmistakable weight of decades, much like the man himself. His boots were polished, his cravat a muted navy, and his silver pocket watch glinted at his hip like a tether to a different time. He said nothing as the Reverend spoke. He merely nodded once, as if to seal a bargain already struck long ago. Clara's voice did not falter when she said, "I do." Her eyes, hazel and unblinking, remained fixed on a knot in the wood floor, just beyond her feet. She did not look up when the Reverend declared them husband and wife, nor when the handful of ranch hands and townsfolk watching from the back pews muttered prayers or exchanged glances filled with speculation and scorn. She heard their thoughts as clearly as if they'd been spoken aloud. He bought her. He's lost his mind. That poor girl. What does she know of running a ranch or sharing a bed with a man like that? The chapel emptied fast, like a barn after lightning. Clara did not cry. She sat silently in the carriage as Jed helped her up, his hand warm, steady, and brief against her gloved wrist. No words were exchanged on the long ride back to the Carter homestead. The land passed by like a painting, wind-blown and brittle. Fences ran crooked across the hills, and cattle grazed like shadows beneath a sky smeared with clouds. Somewhere, a hawk screamed. When they reached the house, Jed dismounted first. He opened the carriage door, but did not offer his hand again. "You'll want to rest," he said simply. She followed him inside. The house was large but quiet. No music, no laughter, no scent of celebration lingered in the air. Only the steady tick of a mantel clock and the creak of floorboards under boots that had seen too many winters. Mrs. Talbot, the housekeeper, met them in the entryway. Her face, round and stern beneath a white linen cap, gave nothing away as she curtsied to Clara. "I've drawn a bath, Mrs. Carter." Clara nodded. "Thank you." The words tasted foreign. She bathed, alone. The water was warm, scented faintly with lavender. She washed the day from her skin, but not from her mind. When she emerged wrapped in flannel, a folded gown lay on the bed, soft cotton in a faded blue, practical and unadorned. Not a wedding night garment, not even close. She dressed, braided her hair with trembling fingers, and stood before the door of the master chamber, unsure whether to knock. It opened before she could decide. Jedediah stood within, his coat removed, vest unbuttoned, sleeves rolled to the elbows. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of an oil lamp on the writing desk. The air smelled of old paper, tobacco, and the faintest trace of horses. He did not smile. "Come in," he said. Clara obeyed. He gestured to a chair. Sit, please. There's something I need you to know. She crossed the room slowly, the floorboards cool beneath her slippers. She sat, folding her hands in her lap. I reckon you think I married you to warm my bed, he said, voice low, gravelled by age and silence. Clara said nothing. Her spine was stiff, her chin high. Her heart beat like a wild thing in her chest. Jed sat opposite her. He reached into a drawer and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, he pulled a folded letter. Its edges were worn, its seal broken. He placed it gently before her. That's from your father, he said. Wrote it 15 years ago. She hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting was familiar. Her throat tightened as she read. Jed, if I don't make it through the winter, promise me you'll look after Clara. Not with pity, not with coin, with your name if it comes to that. She's strong, but the world's cruel. Do what I can't. Her vision blurred. She looked up. You knew him? She whispered. Jed nodded. He saved my life once. I owed him more than I ever repaid. When he passed, I tried to help, quietly, but you wouldn't take charity. And when the bank came knocking, he paused, jaw clenching. Marriage was the only thing that gave you legal protection. It wasn't what I wanted. It was what was left. Clara pressed the letter to her chest. Her breath shook. I won't touch you, Jed said quietly. Not unless you ask. This house is yours. The land too, if you want it. You may call yourself Clara Carter, or not at all, but what I gave today wasn't a claim. It was a shield. She stared at him, the lamp's flame catching the silver in his hair, the lines on his face etched by sun and sorrow. He looked nothing like the villains the town whispered about. He looked tired and kind. He stood and walked to the dresser, where he withdrew a ring, simple gold, untouched by gem or engraving. He placed it on the desk beside the letter. I'll be in the study. If you need anything. Then he left her alone with her thoughts, the silence and the weight of a vow born not of desire, but of loyalty and debt. Clara looked down at the ring, then at her hands. Slowly she picked it up. It was cool against her skin. She did not put it on, not yet. Outside, the wind howled across the open plains. And somewhere in the house, behind thick oak doors, Jedediah Carter sat at his desk, staring into the flame, wondering if promises kept could ever become something more. Morning came with a pale light that spilled gently through the tall windows of the Carter house, diffused by curtains of simple lace. A thin layer of frost clung to the edges of the pane, and beyond it, the prairie stretched endless and bare under a sky tinged with faded gold. The world had turned, quiet and unchanged, but Clara Whitmore was not the same girl who had walked into the chapel the day before. She awoke with the weight of a new name pressing against her ribs, though no one had spoken it aloud yet. Clara Carter. It sounded strange in her own mind, foreign and too big for the narrow shoulders she had tried so long to keep squared. The house around her creaked softly, old wood shifting with the chill. Somewhere down the hall, boots thudded in a slow, steady rhythm. Jedediah, most likely. Already awake, already gone from the room they would never share. Clara sat up slowly, her hair a mess of gold-blonde braids loosened by sleep and worry. She dipped her feet into her boots, wrapped herself in a grey wool shawl, and moved toward the mirror. Her reflection stared back with tired eyes, and a too young face shadowed by things that should not belong to 18. By the time she stepped into the hallway, the scent of brewed coffee and cornmeal biscuits floated toward her like a welcome tether to the earth. She followed it to the kitchen, where Mrs. Talbot stood by the stove with a wooden spoon in one hand and suspicion in the other. The housekeeper did not look up. Coffee's hot. Eat before the sun burns off what little spring we've got. Clara crossed the room with quiet steps. The floor was scrubbed clean, the table worn smooth by generations of use. She sat, folding her hands in her lap. Mrs. Talbot turned, finally meeting her gaze. Her eyes, brown and sharp as a hawk's, lingered just a second too long. You don't look like a woman who married for comfort. Clara's breath caught. I didn't marry for anything, really, only to survive. The housekeeper grunted and set a plate before her. That's honest. More than I can say for most. Clara glanced down. Eggs, biscuits, a thick slice of smoked ham. She wasn't sure she could swallow a bite. "Eat anyway," Mrs. Talbot said, softening just enough to make it sound like care and not command. "You'll need your strength if you plan to walk the land today." "I do." The older woman arched a brow. "You even have proper boots, child?" "I have calluses. That will have to do." Mrs. Talbot snorted once and went back to stirring. A silence settled between them, not awkward, not warm, but cautious, a sort of truce. By mid-morning, Clara stood in the yard with her shawl pulled tight and a pair of borrowed gloves from a ranch hand too polite to question her presence. The wind tugged at her skirts as she stared at the rows of outbuildings, the vast open pastures beyond, and the endless stretch of broken fence that marked the northern ridge. She did not know how to run a ranch, but she would learn, every inch of it, and Dodge City would see, because already it had begun. She had barely stepped off the Carter property that day when the Whispers found her. At the Mercantile, the grocer paused, midweighing a bag of sugar, to cast her a look of theatrical pity. The dressmaker's apprentice pretended to measure a bolt of cotton while leaning in to hiss something behind cupped hands to her employer. Even the postmaster, an old man who rarely looked up from his stamps, gave her a glance that crawled like a question beneath her skin. But it was at the bank where the poison wore a smile. Silas Vance was standing on the steps when she approached. Dressed in a charcoal coat that caught the sun just enough to flash wealth, he tipped his hat with exaggerated civility. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. Clara stopped. She didn't like how the title sounded in his mouth, like a dare. "Mr. Vance," he stepped forward. "You're very brave, taking on a man like Jedediah, or very clever." Her chin lifted. "I was raised to pay my debts." His smile did not fade. "Were you also raised to handle land disputes, cattle yields, tax assessments? I only ask because Carter Ranch is no small thing, and it has complications. I'm learning." Learning takes time, and time is often what ranchers run out of." She stepped closer, letting her words fall like steel. "If you're suggesting that I cannot protect what's mine, I assure you, I've had worse odds and fewer boots." He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course, I meant only to welcome you. You've certainly become the most talked-about bride this town has seen in years. And you, the most practiced vulture." She turned on her heel and walked away without waiting for the color to drain from his face. Behind her, she felt the shift, the silence, the eyes. It followed her down the boardwalk, all the way to the livery where a pair of ranch hands waited with a wagon of supplies. Eli Ruka stood leaning against the post, arms crossed, a half-smile curling under his whiskered lip. "Well, look what wind blew in," he muttered. Clara met his eyes, green, narrow, and filled with something sharper than scorn, bitterness. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said, voice cool. "Eli Ruka, former foreman, before you took over. I haven't taken anything that wasn't offered freely." Eli's smile vanished. "That's not what folks say." "Then folks ought to look closer." He pushed off the post, stepping forward just enough to make her draw breath. "You play your part, Miss Whitmore, pretty and polite. But this land, it breaks people." Clara didn't flinch. "Then it will have to try harder with me." The ranch hands loaded the last of the crates without a word. When she climbed into the wagon, Clara felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing into her back. But she didn't look back. Not once. That evening, she returned to the ranch with windburn on her cheeks and splinters on her palms. She helped unload supplies, wiped down bridles, and whispered to the skittish mare tied near the trough until it calmed. Mrs. Talbot watched from the porch, arms crossed. Later, by the fire, Clara sat at the long oak table with a ledger open before her. Numbers danced before her eyes. Feed costs, branding expenses, a note in Jedediah's hand, tight and neat, beside a list of unpaid taxes. It was the first time she truly understood the size of what she had stepped into. Jed came in as the sun dipped below the line of the hills, his face lined with the fatigue of a day spent fighting prairie wind and the weight of old expectations. He didn't speak at first, only watched her, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair across from hers. "Town's talking," he said finally. "I know. You held your own. I intend to keep doing so." Jed nodded, slow and grave. Then after a long pause, "You don't have to prove anything to me." She looked up, their eyes met, his blue and shadowed, hers lit with something fierce. "I'm not doing it for you." A flicker passed across his face. Not pain, not pride. Something quieter. Respect. He sat across from her, not to question, not to instruct, just to be there. And in the hush between them, something settled. Not affection, not yet, but an understanding, a start. Outside, the prairie wind howled again. But inside, a fire burned steady. Spring deepened its hold over Dodge City with gusts of wind that swept the dust from the prairie into the corners of every room, into the seams of every dress, into the pages of every book. At the Carter Ranch, the earth was waking from its winter slumber. Calves bawled from the lower pastures. The scent of wet wood and fresh hay clung to every breath. But inside the main house, another awakening was underway, one born not of nature, but of numbers and silence. Clara Whitmore had always had a head for figures. Her father had taught her to tally supply costs and measure grain when she was just a girl, kneeling beside his boots at the kitchen table, while he scribbled ledgers by lamplight. He had told her once, "Money speaks, Clara, but if you don't listen close, it lies." She had not forgotten. The Carter ledgers were kept in a heavy wooden cabinet with brass handles dulled by time. The key hung beside the pantry door, where any honest hand could reach it. But Clara noticed immediately that the pages themselves were guarded, not by lock, but by omission. She ran her fingers over the paper, rough at the edges, the ink faded in parts, blotted in others. Certain entries were missing altogether, lines of data that should have been there, numbers for feed, costs for transport, receipts for branding irons replaced last autumn. The handwriting shifted subtly from one entry to another, different pens, different pressure, different intentions. She didn't raise the issue right away. Instead, she copied the entries onto a blank sheet and ran her own tallies, night after night, by the low flame of the parlor lamp. The column of missing cattle grew longer. Expenses listed under repairs were far higher than the damage she had seen in the outbuildings. The same supplier names appeared on overlapping weeks with irregular prices. It wasn't just negligence, it was theft. By the third evening, she could no longer keep it to herself. She waited until Jedediah returned from riding the north fence line. His coat was slung over his shoulder, his shirt collar opened at the neck, dust clinging to his boots. He looked tired, but not surprised when he saw her waiting in the dining room, ledger open in front of her. "I thought you might come across that," he said quietly. Clara's breath hitched. "You knew?" He sat down slowly, his broad hands resting on the table's edge. "I suspected, but I never could prove who. I'm not as fast with the books as I once was." Clara held up the page she had copied. "You don't need speed, you need eyes." He smiled faintly. "That's why you're here, isn't it?" His words were soft, but they stung, as though her purpose was not chosen, but assigned. As though she had been placed at this table like a replacement part in a broken machine. And yet, there was no malice in his voice, only weariness, and something else, deeper, shame. She lowered her gaze. "Someone is bleeding the ranch dry." Jed nodded once. "And I suspect it's someone who knows the land well, someone who knew I wouldn't look too closely. Maybe thought I couldn't." "Eli Rooker," she asked. He exhaled. "Likely, but I let him go months ago. That should have stopped it." It didn't. They sat in silence for a long moment, the wind scraping faintly at the window panes. Then Clara turned the page to a new set of figures. "I want to see the bills of sale from Vance's bank, the ones tied to the river parcel." Jed's brow creased. "Why that parcel?" Clara's eyes lit with something fierce. "Because it's the only land he's shown interest in, and men like Vance never look twice at something unless it's worth more than what's written down." Jed tilted his head. "It's boggy in spring, unreliable for grazing, always has been. But it sits near the old Spanish well," she countered. And there's mineral content in the soil. There might be water rights, or something else he's not saying. A pause. Then Jed stood. He moved to the cabinet and pulled out a thin folder tied with twine. Inside were 2 letters from Silas Vance, one cordial, the other less so, offering to purchase the river parcel to alleviate your financial strain. Clara read them carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. "He wants it badly," she murmured. Jed leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "He's offered twice what it's worth." Clara met his gaze. "Then it's worth even more." Jed said nothing, but in the flicker of his eyes, she saw it. That small flame of belief reigniting, as if her certainty were enough to lift the weight he had carried alone for too long. In the days that followed, Clara and Jed began working together in earnest. Not as husband and wife, there was no talk of such things, but as reluctant partners in a battle neither of them had started, yet both had inherited. She combed through every receipt, while he dictated memories from past transactions, names, timelines, inconsistencies he had dismissed at the time. There were moments, brief but charged, when their hands brushed over the same page, when his voice dropped lower, not in fatigue but in the gravity of trust. Clara found herself studying the way he held a pen, the deep lines around his mouth, the slow, burning intelligence in his gaze. He never touched her. He never presumed. And yet, something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. One evening, as they sat over another day's work, Clara looked up from the ledger. "Do you ever miss it?" Jed blinked. "Miss what?" "The days when you didn't have to question every man who rode your fences." He chuckled, the sound low and rough. "Miss it? No. I suppose I mourn it." She nodded slowly. "I think I mourn my father the same way, not his death, but the life before I had to become someone else." Jed looked at her then, and there was no pity in his expression, only recognition. "You didn't become someone else, Clara. You became exactly who you had to be." They fell silent again, but it was no longer a silence of discomfort. It was the quiet of shared resolve. Outside the parlor window, the prairie swayed under a copper sky. The cattle lowed in the distance. And within the house, 2 people not meant to share a life, barely even meant to cross paths, sat side by side, fighting for a future neither had asked for, but both had begun to claim. That night, long after Jed had retired to his study and Clara had returned to her room, she stood at the window, watching the moon rise over the hills. She thought of Silas Vance and his false smile, of Eli Rooker and his threats veiled in familiarity, of her father, whose handwriting still lived in the margins of her memory, and of Jedediah Carter, who had given her the ranch not as a gift, but as a shield, and who now, piece by piece, was giving her his trust. She pulled the ledger close to her chest and made a silent vow. They may have underestimated her, but she would not let them break him, not with words, not with numbers, not with land stolen one lie at a time, and certainly not with silence. The prairie, that vast and unforgiving expanse of land where the wind wrote its own gospel in dust and silence, greeted the dawn with a restless breath. The light that spilled over the hills was gold and raw, illuminating every scar in the earth and every resolve in the heart. Clara Carter stood at the edge of the corral with her boots planted firm in the dry dirt and her hands curled tightly around the leather reins of a chestnut mare that eyed her with skeptical defiance. "You sure about this, Mrs. Carter?" asked Hank, the eldest of the ranch hands, his brow furrowed beneath a battered hat. "She's not a church pony." "I'm not a Sunday lady," Clara replied, mounting the saddle in one clean motion. The men exchanged glances. Not one of them had spoken out against her directly, but she could feel their questions like the sun on the back of her neck, unrelenting and heavy. It wasn't their fault. They had spent years under the command of Jedediah Carter, a man of few words and absolute direction. And now, a girl with braided hair and city hands had stepped into his house, into his name, and into their routine. Suspicion was natural, but Clara had never been content to live under anyone's doubt, not even God's. "Rides to the South Ridge," Hank said, mounting his own horse. "Check fence posts, look for tracks. Coyotes have been circling the calves again." Oh dear, Clara nodded once, adjusted her gloves and nudged the mare forward. They rode hard. The spring sun was deceptively warm, coaxing sweat from the back of Clara's neck as they pushed through brittle brush and over hills dotted with wild sage. Dust rose around them in plumes, clinging to their clothes, their lashes, their thoughts. The rhythm of hooves became a steady drumbeat beneath her ribs, and though her body ached from the unfamiliarity of it, Clara felt a strange exhilaration blooming in her chest. They stopped once at a broken post where Hank crouched and pointed to the earth. "Prints," he muttered. "Not animal. Boot tread. Someone walked the line last night." Clara dismounted, knees stiff, and studied the ground. The prints were wide-set and deep. A heavy man walking with purpose. Her jaw tightened. "You think it was him?" she asked. Hank didn't answer, but his silence was loud. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the sun hung low and orange in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Clara's legs trembled as she dismounted, her body sore and her skirt stained with dust and sweat. She bore a bruise on her thigh from where the saddle had bitten too hard on a downhill gallop, but her eyes shone. Mrs. Talbot met her at the door with a cloth and a look of restrained approval. "Thought we'd have to carry you back." "You might yet," Clara replied with a half-smile, wiping her hands. "But not today." Later, as she soaked in a tin tub drawn with hot water and eucalyptus leaves, she stared at the flickering light of the oil lamp and let her mind drift, not to pain but to power, to the raw, blinding truth of her body in motion across the land, to the grit under her fingernails and the strength that now ached in her arms. She was not ornamental. She was not an intruder. She was becoming something new, forged by trail dust and silence. But peace never lingered long on prairie wind. 2 days later, Clara found one of the ranch hands, Miguel, standing near the barn, with blood dripping from a gash above his brow and fury in his jaw. "What happened?" she demanded. Miguel hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "Eli Rooker." The name hit her like a nail to the chest. "He caught me behind the post line," Miguel said in low, ashamed tones. "Said I was trespassing. Accused me of stealing cattle. He said the Carter brand don't mean much anymore, that we'd all be better off letting go." Clara's blood ran cold. "Did he have a weapon?" "A whip." She clenched her fists. "And you didn't fight back?" "I got family, Senora," he murmured. "If I go to jail, they starve." Clara turned and walked straight to the stable, where she found Hank saddling up for evening watch. "Ride with me," she said. Hank paused, eyes narrowing. "Where?" "To the river post, where Eli likes to linger." He didn't argue. Perhaps he saw the fire in her jaw, or perhaps he had waited long enough for someone to say what they all feared. They rode in silence. The wind was thick with dust, and the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the bluffs. When they reached the edge of the parcel, Clara dismounted and stood beside the fence, watching the shadows creep along the dry grass. He came as expected. Eli Rooker stepped from behind a crooked fence post, dust on his boots, a smug curl to his lips. "Evening," he drawled, tipping his hat with mock respect. "Are you lost?" Clara asked, her voice steel. He laughed. "Funny thing, I was about to ask you the same. You attacked one of my men." "Your men," he repeated, incredulous. "They're Carter's men. Or they were, until he forgot what kind of land this is." Clara took a slow step forward. "You have no place here." Eli's smile dropped. "You think a pretty dress and a dying ranch make you queen of this dust pile? You think Jed's name gives you the right to swing orders like a cattle bell?" Hank shifted in his saddle. "You need to ride on, Rooker." Eli didn't move. He looked at Clara, and for the first time his voice lost its swagger. "This land ruins people, girl. You'll learn that, or it'll teach you." Clara held his gaze. "I'd rather be ruined fighting for what's mine than saved by crawling for what's yours." Eli didn't reply. He turned slowly, spat into the dirt, and walked back toward his horse. That night, Jed found Clara on the porch, still wearing her boots, still dust-streaked and silent. He sat beside her without a word. The air between them was heavy with things not yet said. "He's watching the parcel," Clara whispered, "pressuring the men, spreading poison." Jed stared out at the horizon. I should have ended it when he first turned bitter. Clara turned her head to him. You still can. And he looked at her then, truly looked at her, not as the girl he'd married to fulfill a dying promise, not as the orphan in a dress too plain for society, but as a woman burning with something stronger than vengeance. Purpose. You're changing this place, he said softly. No, she replied. I'm letting it change me. And then in that fragile dusk, under the creak of the windmill and the lowing of cattle far beyond, Jedediah Carter reached out, not to touch her, but to let his fingers rest beside hers on the wooden step, just close enough for her to feel the warmth, just enough for her to choose whether to close the distance. She didn't move, but she didn't pull away. The wind lifted the edge of her shawl. A coyote howled in the distance, and the prairie, endless and wounded, held its breath. The day began with stillness. The kind of prairie silence that came not from peace, but from anticipation. The wind had quieted, the cattle grazed low in the southern field, and the air was heavy with the scent of warm soil and the faint iron tang of approaching rain. Clara Carter rose before the sun, as she always did now, though she no longer needed to. The ranch had begun to move around her without protest. The men no longer looked twice when she issued a command. The housekeeper no longer shadowed her steps. Even the horses had stopped testing her. But that morning, something in her chest felt unsettled, as if something had been waiting in the dark to be found. She was in the study by mid-morning, fingers blackened with dust, sleeves rolled up as she rifled through the cabinet drawers that lined the far wall. She had been searching for old tax ledgers, records Jedediah claimed were somewhere in that mess. What she found instead was a false panel behind a row of faded shipping invoices. Behind it, a small iron strongbox sat nestled in a hollow space, its lock rusted but intact. She hesitated. Then, with the cautious firmness she had learned from handling skittish colts, she pried the lid open. Inside were 2 velvet pouches of coin, a folded deed for a parcel of land she didn't recognize, and a thin bundle of letters bound by a faded black ribbon. They bore her father's handwriting. Clara sat slowly on the edge of the desk chair, her breath suddenly shallow. Her fingers trembled as she undid the ribbon. The first sheet was dated 12 years prior, 1 year after her mother had passed, 5 years before the fever took her father. Jed, it began, in ink that bled just slightly at the edges. If you're reading this, I've either broken my stubborn streak and come asking for help, or I'm gone. She swallowed hard and kept reading. Clara is strong. Too strong for her own good sometimes, but she's still a child, and this world, it doesn't show mercy to girls without names or protectors. If I don't make it, I'm asking you, not as a man of wealth or land, but as the man who once took a bullet to protect a stranger's horse, watch over her, not with coin, not with sympathy, but with your name, if it comes to that. She deserves better than I gave her, and I trust you more than I ever trusted blood. Her eyes blurred. The edges of the letter shook in her hands, though she held them tight. She read it again, then a third time. Every word etched itself into her ribs like a brand. When Jed entered the room 20 minutes later, wiping mud from his gloves, he stopped short in the doorway. He took one look at her face and lowered his gaze to the letter in her hands. I found it, she said quietly. He nodded once, stepped inside, and shut the door behind him. How long have you kept this from me? Since the day he handed it to me, Jed replied, his voice low, grave. Clara stood. You had no right. I had every right, he interrupted, not with anger, but with weight. He asked me to protect you, not to own you. If I'd told you when you were 16 or 18 or the day I proposed, you would have seen it as a command, as duty. Tears pooled in her eyes, not out of weakness but betrayal. And marrying me wasn't? Jed's jaw tightened. I married you because there was no other way to shield you from Vance. I never touched you. I never claimed what wasn't mine. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. But you stood beside me at that altar, knowing I didn't have the whole truth. I gave you the choice, he said, stepping forward, his gaze unwavering, even if the ground beneath it was cracked. She turned away, wiping at her cheek with the back of her hand. You should have trusted me. And you should have had the time to grieve before being handed to a man twice your age." Silence filled the room, not cold, not cruel, but full. Jed sighed, his voice softer now. "I did what I thought was right. Maybe it wasn't, but I won't apologize for keeping a promise to your father. I owe him more than you know." Clara folded the letter slowly and held it against her chest. She had no more words. Only the strange, unbearable pressure of everything she'd held back since the day the fever took her father. The day she stopped being anyone's daughter, the day she stopped crying. Now, standing in a room that smelled of old paper and cracked leather, with the man who had carried her name like armor and guilt, she broke. Her shoulders shook once, then again, and then the sobs came. Jed didn't speak. He didn't move at first. But when she dropped into the worn leather chair beside the hearth and buried her face in her hands, he came forward, slowly, as if unsure whether she would allow him near. He knelt beside her and rested one hand gently on her forearm. She didn't pull away, and so he stayed, just like that, letting her grieve, letting her feel, letting her be a daughter, if only for a moment more. When the storm within her had passed, when the last tear dried on her cheek, Clara looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks blotched, her voice a whisper. "You were the only person he ever trusted. I can see that now." Jed's expression didn't change, but his fingers brushed her wrist ever so slightly, anchoring her in the present. "I didn't marry you for love," she said, "but I'm starting to wonder if what we build from something broken might still hold." His breath caught. "That's not something I'd ever ask you for." "You don't have to," she murmured. They sat there together, surrounded by old secrets and the flicker of a low-burning fire. Outside, thunder rumbled distantly in the west, a warning or a blessing. Neither of them knew, but inside the house, in that quiet moment where grief met grace, a truth settled between them, not born of passion or obligation, but of something deeper, trust. And from trust, all things might grow, even love, even now, even here. The sky above Dodge City had never felt so close. Clouds hung low and heavy, the color of iron and bruises, while the wind whispered promises it did not intend to keep. Clara stood by the corral as dusk bled slowly into night, her shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, eyes turned westward. There was something in the air, something brittle and restless, like a breath being held too long. The stables were unusually quiet. Even the horses seemed to sense it. The younger mares shifted uneasily, hooves scraping against the floorboards, their snorts sharp and shallow. Jed had ridden out that afternoon to speak with a neighboring rancher and had not yet returned. Clara watched the tree line, searching for the faint rise of dust that would announce his approach. Instead, what reached her was the scent, faint at first, then undeniable. Smoke. She turned sharply. Behind the stables, a flicker of orange broke through the dark. Clara didn't scream. She ran. By the time she reached the barn doors, flames were climbing fast across the far wall, eating through dry timber like paper. One of the hay bales had caught fully, casting sparks into the rafters. The horses shrieked in panic, slamming against their stalls, eyes wild. Clara threw the latch and swung open the door, the rush of heat slamming into her face like a wall. "Easy!" she cried out, coughing. "Easy now!" She didn't stop to think. She moved from stall to stall, unlatching gates, slapping reins into her palm, guiding the animals one by one toward the yard. The smoke stung her eyes, clawed at her throat. Sparks landed on her skirt, singeing the hem. Somewhere behind her, a beam groaned. Then, "Clara!" Jed's voice, fierce and near. He burst into the stable, his coat already discarded, his face streaked with soot. "What in God's name? Help me!" she shouted, waving smoke from her face. "There are still 3 in the back." He didn't argue. Together they worked as one, opening stalls, soothing terrified animals, guiding them through the smoke-choked corridor as the roof threatened to give way above them. Jed took the reins of a stallion so wild it nearly knocked him flat, but he held his ground, bracing with the strength of someone who had lived long enough to know that fear was only wind. It passed. When the last horse burst into the night, Clara stumbled back toward the doorway, one arm pressed over her mouth. Her vision blurred. Her legs buckled. The heat was unbearable now. Then Jed was beside her, catching her just before she hit the ground. He didn't speak. He lifted her in his arms and carried her into the open air, where the ranch hands were forming a line with water buckets, shouting and pouring in vain against the blaze that had already claimed most of the structure. Clara coughed violently, gripping Jed's shirt front, her lungs aching for clean air. His arms stayed firm beneath her. "It's all right," he whispered into her hair, low and rough. "I've got you." The stable collapsed an hour later in a hiss of steam and sparks. They stood together in the yard, watching the charred remains sink into themselves. The horses grazed nervously in the distance, trembling and slick with sweat. Clara's dress was ruined, blackened with soot. Her hands scraped raw. Someone brought her a wet cloth. Another offered brandy. She refused both. It wasn't until the smoke had thinned and the fire was fully gone that Jed said what had hung in the air since the first spark. This was no accident. Clara didn't look at him. Her voice was cold, steady. "Eli." Jed's silence was confirmation. "There were no storm clouds," she continued. "No lanterns left burning. No sign of anything except intent." He nodded once. "Then we go to the sheriff," she said. But Jed didn't answer. She turned to him. "We have witnesses, circumstance. What more do you need?" He looked tired. Tired in the bones, in the soul. "I need time," he said. Clara's anger flared hot and sharp. "Time? He nearly burned us alive. He did burn half the horse's shelter. He'll do worse if we wait." Jed faced her, jaw tight. "He's not alone in this." She froze. "Silas is behind him," Jed continued, "feeding him, protecting him. And if we move too soon, without proof, without strategy, Vance will bury the evidence before we can speak." Clara folded her arms, smoke still clinging to her skin. "So we do nothing?" "We plan," Jed replied. "We build a case, with names, with dates. We follow the money, and when we go to the law, we don't bring suspicion. We bring truth so heavy it can't be moved." His voice was low but thunderous in its certainty. Clara looked away, jaw clenched. "He could have killed us." Jed stepped closer. "I know." There was something in his gaze now she hadn't seen before. Not fear, not calculation, but grief. And something deeper than that. "I thought I could handle this without dragging you into it," he admitted. "But this land doesn't respect silence anymore. It never did." She met his eyes then, and what passed between them wasn't new. It had been building for weeks. But now it stood fully formed in the space between them. Not love, not yet, but loyalty. Built not on promises made, but on promises kept in the heat of fire and the ache of restraint. He reached out, not to take her hand, but to rest his fingers beside hers, just close enough that their skin brushed. "Then we bring them down together," Clara said. Jed nodded. Together. That night, as the ranch settled into uneasy quiet and the smell of wet ash lingered in the halls, Clara sat beside the hearth with an open ledger and a pen in hand. Her body ached, her eyes burned, but her spine stayed straight. Across the table, Jed sat with a fresh cup of coffee, flipping through a folder of letters, marking each with a careful eye. Their words were few, but their presence, side by side, firelight casting twin shadows on the walls, spoke louder than any vow. And somewhere beyond the window, beneath the charred remains of the stable, the prairie whispered back. They would not break. The storm rolled in from the east, slow and deliberate, with skies the color of wet slate and thunder that trembled across the earth like distant cannon fire. Long before the first drop fell, the animals had quieted and the prairie birds had vanished into the grasslands. The wind began to stir in heavy sighs through the cottonwoods, and the scent of rain seeped into the parched air. Inside the Carter ranch house, Clara sat at the head of the dining table with a ledger open before her, and her fingers smudged in ink. Her back was straight, her brow furrowed in concentration. The room around her smelled of paper, tobacco, and the faint lavender soap she'd begun using each evening. Just a trace, just enough to soften the air after long days spent among livestock and leather. Mrs. Talbot appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "The men just came in," she said. "Rain's not far off." Clara nodded without looking up. "Let's see if it puts out more than it soaks." There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps approaching. Clara felt the presence before she saw it. Saw her. The older woman set a cup of tea gently beside the ledger. "You missed lunch again, Miss Clara." Clara looked up, blinking. "Sorry." Mrs. Talbot didn't repeat herself. She only met Clara's eyes and offered something the younger woman hadn't seen from her in weeks. A smile. Small, but warm, earnest. Clara stared for a second too long, surprised by the softness of it. She offered a smile in return, grateful and quiet. "Thank you," she said. Mrs. Talbot inclined her head, and then, as she turned to go, added, "That was a fine thing you did for Miguel's boy yesterday." Clara blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you didn't have to give up your coat to keep him warm. You didn't have to kneel in the mud beside him just to calm his fever. But you did." Clara swallowed. "He's only 6, and I know what it's like to shake without anyone holding your hand." The older woman paused once more at the door, her voice quiet and full of something that sounded almost like pride. "Jed was right to trust you." And then she was gone. Clara sat still for a moment, stunned. Then she closed the ledger and rose from her chair. Later that afternoon, as clouds darkened the sky and the first gusts of wind slapped against the window panes, Jed returned from town with his coat dripping and a parcel tucked beneath his arm. He stomped the mud from his boots and handed the wrapped bundle to Clara without ceremony. She tilted her head. "What is it?" "Open it." She unwrapped the paper slowly. Inside was a dark leather saddle blanket stitched with her initials, CW, and beside it, a bridle trimmed in silver. Folded beneath both was a note, brief and unsigned. "Her name is Esperanza. She's yours now." Clara blinked down at the note, then looked up at him, mouth parted. "Jed." "She's young," he said gruffly, pulling off his gloves. "But she's steady. She'll take to you quickly." Clara pressed her palm gently against the smooth leather of the bridle. It smelled of pine oil and new beginnings. "Why her?" she asked softly. He met her gaze. "Because she doesn't spook when the wind changes. She leans into it." Their eyes held for a beat longer than necessary, longer than safe, and then the thunder cracked above them and the house shivered in its bones. That night, the rain came hard. The sky wept in sheets, pounding the roof, filling the gutters, sweeping dust from the yard in rivulets of red mud. The windows rattled with each clap of thunder, and the fire in the hearth danced wild and tall. The ranch hands had taken shelter in the bunkhouse, their laughter faint in the distance. Mrs. Talbot had long since retired. The house was quiet, save for the storm and the fire's breathing. Clara stood near the window, arms folded, watching the rain blur the horizon. Jed approached quietly. He wore a soft flannel shirt, sleeves rolled, the collar open. His face looked drawn in the firelight, not from age but from weight, years of responsibility, of holding things too long without rest. "I've never seen you afraid of storms," she said. "I used to chase them," he replied. "When I was younger, I thought the world would end before I did. And now I watch. Let it pass. Let it speak." Clara turned from the window and moved to the hearth, sitting on the rug with her knees drawn up beneath her skirt. Jed joined her a moment later, settling slowly into the chair across from her. They did not speak for a while. The fire popped and hissed. The rain battered the windows. The house felt like a ship adrift in a dark, roaring sea. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "You gave me a mare. You gave me your name. You've given me 1,000 things I never expected. But you've never asked me for anything in return." Jed looked at her steadily. "Would you rather I did?" "No," she whispered, "but I wonder why." He didn't answer immediately. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames. "Because I knew what it meant when I stood beside you in that chapel," he said slowly. "It wasn't a beginning for you, it was a shield, and I'll carry it until you decide it no longer serves you." Clara's breath caught. Her throat tightened. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "Not with you. Not with any of this." "You're doing more than anyone expected," Jed replied, and the words were not flattery, they were faith. She reached forward without thinking. Her hand found his, rough, warm, scarred. She didn't grip it. She simply placed her fingers over his knuckles, as if to say, I see you. I am here. You are not alone. Jed's hand did not move beneath hers, but he did not pull away. For several heartbeats, they sat like that, two people forged by loss and dust and silence, holding a truth neither of them dared name. And as the fire burned low and the storm roared outside, the house, solid and worn, stood firm, like them, not lovers. Not yet, but something just as strong, a courtship without flowers, a romance without words, respect, earned and offered like a hand in the dark. The morning of the hearing arrived, draped in an unnatural stillness. Even the wind seemed to hesitate at the edge of town, as if unwilling to witness the storm that would unfold within the wooden walls of the Dodge City courthouse. Clara stood at the mirror in the upstairs bedroom, pulling her hair into a smooth coil and fixing it with the pearl-tipped pins she had worn only once before, on her wedding day. Her hands moved with precision, but her chest ached with the weight of all that lay ahead. Today was not about appearances. It was about truth, about vindication, about standing for something that would not bow to fear. Below, Jed waited by the wagon. He wore his dark wool coat, a crisp white shirt, and the watch chain she had once seen glinting beneath the dust of his vest. His posture was straight, despite the ache in his hip, and his eyes, blue as prairie frost, held the quiet resolve of a man who had lived too long with unfinished battles. As Clara stepped down the stairs, a hush fell over the house. Mrs. Talbot stood at the bottom, her apron folded and her arms crossed over her chest. She did not speak, but she reached out and adjusted the lace collar of Clara's dress with gentle fingers. "You speak from your heart," the housekeeper said softly. "They won't forget that." Clara nodded, then turned to Jed. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be." The courthouse loomed at the edge of Main Street, whitewashed but peeling, its shutters open like waiting eyes. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered. Ranchers, merchants, clerks, townsfolk, with no direct stake but hungry for spectacle. Whispers flitted like flies through the air. "She's going to fight it. Did you hear what Vance is accusing them of? Old Jed's finally done for. They say she's got proof." Inside, the room smelled of pine floorboards, ink and nerves. The judge, a balding man with sharp features and an even sharper sense of order, sat at the raised bench, flanked by two clerks. The benches were full. The pews creaked as people shifted, leaned, murmured. Silas Vance stood to one side of the courtroom, his suit immaculate, his cravat tied in a crisp knot. He held a stack of documents like a weapon, his gaze sweeping the room with false serenity. Beside him stood a thin man with ink-stained fingers, his lawyer, or perhaps his shield. Clara and Jed sat opposite them. She kept her chin lifted, her back straight. The folder in her hands was worn at the edges from nights of review and annotation. When the gavel struck wood, all rose. The trial began. Silas's accusations were delivered with cold civility, as though he were reporting a weather pattern or a miscalculation of harvest yields. He claimed that Jedediah Carter had defaulted on 2 loan installments and that the Carter land, particularly the river parcel, had been pledged as collateral. The foreclosure, he said, was a simple matter of legal procedure. Clara's jaw clenched. When her turn came, she stood. The room stilled. "I am Clara Whitmore Carter," she began, her voice clear but not loud. "I speak not only as Jedediah's wife, but as someone who has spent the past months immersed in the ledgers, the land, and the history of this ranch." She lifted a letter. "This was written by my father, Caleb Whitmore, to Jedediah Carter before his death. It is not a contract. It is not a plea. It is a vow entrusted between men who understood loyalty." She unfolded the paper and began to read. The room held its breath. As she spoke, her father's words aloud, words that asked for protection, not pity, that spoke of a girl who deserved more than the world had offered. She saw faces shift. Hardened men lowered their gazes, wives pressed handkerchiefs to their eyes. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she set the letter down and opened the ledger. These are records we discovered in the Carter accounts. Double entries, falsified invoices, branding inconsistencies. And here, she held up a page, a logbook kept by the ranch hands, noting brands that were changed under Eli Rooker's supervision on nights when Jedediah was bedridden and unaware. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Silas's face remained impassive, but the lawyer beside him paled. "We also have affidavits," Clara continued, "from two of those ranch hands, Hank Dobson and Miguel Espinoza, confirming that they witnessed stolen cattle, altered records and threats made by Mr. Rooker to any man who questioned his orders." Judge Lowry raised a hand. "Are those witnesses present today?" Clara turned. They rose from the back row, hats in hand, boots echoing on the wooden floor as they made their way to the front. Miguel nodded once at Clara. Hank offered a slight smile. One by one they testified, clear, direct, unshaken. And then, to Clara's surprise, Mrs. Talbot stood. The judge narrowed his eyes. "You wish to add your testimony, ma'am?" "I do," she said, stepping forward with her usual calm. "I've run the Carter household for over 20 years. I've seen every man who walked through those doors. I saw Eli Rooker bring in documents late at night, and I saw Silas Vance's messenger collect parcels that never passed Jedediah's hands. I didn't speak then because I feared losing the roof over my head. But today I fear losing something greater, my name, and I will not let that be tarnished by lies." A silence deeper than reverence followed. Silas shifted at last, sweat dotting his brow despite the cool room. His lawyer whispered something urgently, but he waved him off. The judge tapped his gavel. "I've heard enough." The court stood still as he shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and delivered his verdict. "There is no sufficient evidence to support foreclosure. The documents provided by Mr. Vance are inconsistent with established records, and the witness testimony confirms intent to defraud. I hereby dismiss the foreclosure claim. Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into the business practices of Mr. Vance and his associates." The room erupted. Whispers turned to exclamations. Silas's face darkened as if all blood had fled from it. His lawyer began to argue, but the judge slammed his gavel once more and ordered the room cleared. Eli Rooker, who had been lurking in the rear, slipped through the side door before anyone could stop him. By the time the deputies were called, he was gone. Clara sat, her hands trembling slightly. Jed placed his hand over hers, grounding her. Outside the courthouse, the sky had cleared. People stared as they exited, some with awe, others with guilt, and a few with admiration. But Clara kept her gaze steady, her pace even. They rode back to the ranch in silence. That evening the fire burned low, and the house exhaled. Clara stood at the porch, staring into the wide, quiet night. Jed came to stand beside her. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was terrified," she replied. "That's what made you strong." She turned to him. For the first time, their hands didn't meet by accident or necessity, but by choice. And in that soft, long silence, the weight of power shifted, not in the courtroom, but here, between two souls who had fought for each other in ways that no law could define. The heat had settled over Dodge City like a heavy blanket, clinging to the skin, pressing down on the lungs. The prairie grasses stood tall and brittle, their golden tips swaying under the weight of late summer. Dust curled at the edges of boots and windowsills alike, and the sound of locusts filled the silence that followed long days. Inside the Carter house, the shutters were drawn against the glare. The rooms had taken on a hush, the kind that comes not from peace but from pause, a moment suspended between what was and what might be. Jed sat at the table in the study, the same one where so many quiet nights had been shared over ledgers and letters. But tonight there was no open book, no ink pot, only two pieces of paper laid carefully across the polished surface. One, a folded document bearing the county seal. The other, a deed to 40 acres just north of the ridge. The room smelled of sun-warmed wood, old tobacco, and something more elusive, melancholy. He heard her before he saw her, the soft tread of her boots on the stair, the whisper of her skirts against the frame of the door. When Clara stepped into the room, she paused, not from hesitation, but from the weight of something she felt even before a word was spoken. Jed didn't rise. He only looked at her. His face, lined by time and weather, held the gravity of a man who had wrestled long with something he could no longer keep to himself. "I had these drawn up," he said, gesturing toward the papers. Clara frowned, stepping closer. The first document caught her eye, the unmistakable language of annulment, legal, final, cold. Her throat tightened. "What is this?" "A choice," Jed replied. She looked up sharply. "Yours or mine?" "Yours. It's always been yours." He leaned back in his chair, hands resting on the table, steady despite the storm behind his gaze. "I didn't marry you out of love, Clara. I married you out of a promise. I gave you my name to shield you from men like Vance. And somewhere along the way, you became more to this land than I ever was. But you deserve to decide now, without obligation, without debt, without my shadow over your shoulder." Clara stared at him, the words striking not like arrows, but like soft, relentless rain. "And the deed?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "To the land near the orchard," he said. "Untouched soil, yours, free and clear. Not part of Carter Ranch, not a gift. A place to stand if you choose to walk away." She moved to the table slowly, as if her body didn't quite belong to her. She ran her fingers over the edge of the deed, then the annulment. "You're giving me a way out," she whispered. "I'm giving you a door that only you can open." The silence between them stretched until it ached. Outside, the sun had begun to fall, staining the sky in bruised colors. The air pulsed with heat and a promise of storm. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything now." Clara didn't weep. She didn't rail. She simply nodded once, picked up the documents, and walked out the door. Jed didn't follow. She left the house as twilight bled into darkness. Her heart was a knot, her steps unsure. The air outside felt strange, as though the world itself held its breath. Days passed. The first morning away, she stayed in the caretaker's cabin near the river parcel. The walls were rough but clean. The floor sloped. There was no mirror, no fire in the hearth. Only a small table, a cot, and the sound of wind through cottonwood trees. Clara did not sleep well. The next day, she rode Esperanza along the ridge, the new parcel stretching ahead of her, unfamiliar and untouched. The land was beautiful. Soft hills, wildflowers, a narrow stream, but it did not feel like home. It felt like solitude dressed in summer light. She tried to convince herself that this was what she had asked for, what she had worked toward: freedom, space, autonomy. But in the stillness, her mind turned to things she could not ignore. The ledger pages marked with Jed's careful notes, the heat of his hand beside hers on the porch rail, the way he had looked at her, not with possession but with reverence, restraint, the way no one else ever had. She cooked. She read. She tried not to listen for hoofbeats on the road. But when the third day came, so did the storm. It rose from the western hills with a ferocity that shook the trees and blackened the sky. Rain fell in sheets, drumming the roof of the cabin. Wind lashed at the windows. Clara stood at the threshold, the deed in one hand, the annulment in the other, and something inside her broke free. She saddled Esperanza in the downpour, her skirts soaked to the bone, her heart pounding like thunder in her chest. The trail back to the Carter Ranch was slick, the wind fierce, but she rode with fire in her belly. The house came into view just as a bolt of lightning split the sky. She dismounted before the porch, the rain sheeting down her face, her hair unbound and tangled with storm. Jed stood at the door, backlit by the glow of the fire, his expression unreadable. She didn't speak until she reached him. Her eyes met his, fierce and unflinching. "I never wanted freedom from you, Jedediah," she said, her voice low, raw. "Only truth." He stepped back instinctively as she lifted the annulment and tore it clean down the middle. The sound of the paper ripping was loud in the quiet. She let it fall. For a long moment, They stood like that, drenched and trembling, the wind swirling between them, the door open behind him, the fire flickering inside. Jed reached out slowly, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "You didn't have to come back," he said. "I didn't," she whispered. "I chose to." Their eyes held, and for the first time the weight between them shifted, not with uncertainty, but with resolution. Clara stepped past the threshold, not as a bride uncertain of her place, but as a woman who had claimed it. The storm raged on outside, but inside they stood in the quiet, together. Autumn came early that year. The air turned crisp before the leaves had time to fade, and the prairie sky stretched wider than ever, washed in gold by day, deep indigo by night. The scent of cut hay and ripened apples drifted through the valley. Along the Carter Ranch fence line, cornstalks bowed heavy with bounty. Everywhere one looked, life answered the trials of summer with abundance. It was Clara's idea to hold the harvest gathering, not a grand affair, nothing fancy or formal, just the community, the land, and a fire to warm them. A way to mark not only the season's yield, but the endurance it had taken to reach it. The invitation had spread quietly through the town and hills. No printed posters, no formal calls, just Clara's voice and the soft certainty that those meant to come would. By late afternoon, wagons rolled in from every direction. Ranchers, farmhands, school teachers and store clerks stepped down with pies wrapped in flannel, jars of preserves, and instruments tucked under arms. Even Mrs. Talbot, who never left the ranch unless forced, tied a yellow ribbon in her hair and baked 4 loaves of cornbread. The old barn was strung with lanterns and pine garlands. The long tables were draped in linen cloths stitched by Clara's own hand and covered in dishes that steamed and shimmered in the soft golden light. Fiddles tuned. Children chased one another through piles of straw. Laughter rang out like bells. Clara stood at the edge of the gathering, her gown a deep burgundy that caught the last rays of sunlight. Her hair was pinned in a low twist, soft tendrils curling around her face. Her eyes scanned the horizon, calm and clear, like still water after storm. Jed found her there, watching the sky shift. "You look like you belong in this land," he said. She turned to him, her smile slow. "I never knew how much I needed to." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked together among the guests, receiving nods, handshakes, and sometimes more, hushed words of gratitude, of respect, of apology. The hands no longer saw her as the young bride of an aging rancher. She was the Ridge now, the one who had held fast through fire and betrayal and never turned from the wind. As night fell and the stars began to scatter across the sky, the music grew softer, more tender. Couples danced in the open dirt yard, lanterns swinging gently overhead. Shadows lengthened and time slowed. Clara and Jed found themselves alone near the edge of the grove, beneath the cottonwoods that lined the dry creek bed. The same trees that had borne witness to Clara's first ride alone across the ranch. The same trees that had heard her laughter, her shouts, and her tears. Now they stood in quiet, their branches swaying lightly in the evening breeze. Jed removed his hat and held it to his chest. "Clara," he said softly, "I know I've given you land and a name and time, but I've never given you this." She tilted her head, curious. Her heart knew what he meant, but she waited. He stepped closer, not in hunger, not in claim, but in reverence. "I've never asked for anything," he said, "but if it's yours to give, I'd take your heart gladly." Clara's breath caught. She didn't answer in words. Instead, she lifted her hand to his cheek, calloused and warm beneath her fingers. Her thumb brushed along the line of his jaw. Then, slowly, she leaned forward. Their lips met beneath the trees. It was not a kiss of youth or desperation. It was the kind of kiss that comes after war has ended. Quiet, sure, a vow made without ceremony. The cottonwoods rustled above them. No one else saw. No one else needed to. Later, as the fires burned low and the guests began to depart, Clara returned to the house and unpinned her hair. Jed stoked the hearth. The windows glowed with lamplight, the walls warm with the sound of life still echoing outside. In the days that followed, they made their plans. Clara's parcel, the one given in freedom, was merged into the Carter spread, not by decree but by agreement. Jed insisted the land bear her brand, not his. A stylized C, wrapped in vines, burned gently into the fence posts and livestock tags. The hands started calling it Clara's Ridge. No one questioned it, and the ranch, once viewed by outsiders as an empire built by a grizzled cattleman, became something more. It became a place of shared ownership, of soil and spirit intertwined, of roots laid down not by tradition, but by decision. Jed remained Jed, gruff, quiet, and steady as stone. But those who looked closely saw the difference. His steps were lighter, his laughter more frequent, his silence less burdened. Clara flourished. She managed the accounts with effortless grace. She rode the ridge each morning with Esperanza, now heavily pregnant. She sat in on town meetings, advised neighboring farms, and organized schooling for ranch children. The town began to change its tune. Even Silas Vance's name faded into a warning, not a threat. His holdings, seized by court order, were sold off piece by piece. No one asked where he'd gone. As for Eli Rooker, no one saw him again. Rumors flickered like lightning bugs. Some said he drowned trying to cross Red Hill Creek. Others claimed he was hiding in the arroyos near the border. But no one searched, and no one said his name aloud. Not anymore. Then, one afternoon, Jed rode out to the main gate. The sun was high. Clara stood beside him, holding a chisel and a small hammer. Together, they carved a plaque into the beam above the entrance. Carter, 1878, no initials, no other name. Clara ran her fingers across the grooves, the wood still warm from the sun. "It's not a gift," she said. Jed looked at her. "No, it's not a rescue. No, it's what we built." He nodded. "A partnership," he said, voice rough with quiet pride, "forged in fire and choice." They stood beneath the beam for a long time, wind stirring the dust around their boots. There was no music, no applause. Only the land itself, and the sound of two hearts that had chosen, over and over again, not to abandon the hard path. The path that led to love not promised, but earned. And in that moment, the prairie stretched out before them, endless, patient, waiting, just like the love that had always been there beneath the dust. Epilogue, 8 years later, Ford County, autumn of 1886. The wind swept across the ridge in soft, rhythmic gusts, stirring the dry grasses and rustling the cottonwoods that lined the edge of Clara's Ridge. The leaves had turned to rust and gold, catching the sun like embers just before dusk. The land looked much the same as it had nearly a decade ago, wide, untamed, resolute, but everything else had changed. A boy's laughter rang through the air. From the porch of the Carter house, now freshly painted and expanded with a wide veranda, Clara watched her son race barefoot through the yard, chasing a dog with ears too big and a bark too proud. Samuel Jedediah Carter, just turned 7, stubborn as summer heat, and with the same quiet intensity in his eyes that his father carried like an inheritance. Jed sat nearby in a rocking chair carved by hand, one leg crossed over the other, a book resting on his lap, but forgotten. His hair had gone completely silver, and he moved slower now, his joints aching from years of hard work and harder winters. But his voice remained strong, his gaze sharp, and his hand, when it reached for Clara's, still sent warmth through her bones. She joined him with a cup of coffee, her dress simple but finely made, the same shade of deep burgundy she'd worn the night of the harvest gathering. A small pin glinted at her collar, a stylized C wrapped in vines, their brand, their story. "Wind's turning cold early this year," Jed murmured. Clara nodded. "So's the boy. He nearly tried to brand the dog this morning." Jed chuckled. He'd have more luck branding the wind. Their fingers laced together, the gesture as natural now as breath. Years had passed, and with them came hardships. Poor rains one season, a difficult carving another, the loss of Mrs. Talbot to fever one cruel winter. But none had undone what they built. The ranch thrived. The Carter name, once spoken with suspicion, was now respected in every corner of Ford County. But more than that, Clara's Ridge had become legend, a place run by fairness, forged in fire and marked by love earned, not inherited. Inside the house, another voice called out, "Ma, Papa, the beans are burning." Clara rose with a sigh and a smile. Heir to a kingdom of cattle, and he can't watch a pot. She disappeared through the door, her laughter echoing behind her. As twilight deepened, Jed remained on the porch, watching the horizon. His heart, once burdened by silence and secrets, now beat steady with gratitude. He had never imagined this life. He had expected to die alone, with only land and ghosts for company. Instead, he had been given a wife who chose him not once, but every day since. A son who bore both their tempers and their tenderness. A legacy not written in bloodlines, but in choice. And yet, not all shadows had faded. Rumors still stirred from time to time. A traveler had once claimed to see a gaunt figure in the canyons south of Red Hills. Others spoke of cattle gone missing near the border, brands crudely burned off. Eli Rooker's name was never uttered in public. But in quiet moments, Jed wondered if the man still breathed, if he watched from afar, waiting, or if the land itself had taken him. It didn't matter now. Justice, as Clara often said, had many forms. Sometimes it came in courtrooms, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the loneliness a man carries when he's run from truth too long. Inside the house, the light of oil lamps glowed through the windows. Clara moved through the kitchen, her braid streaked now with silver, but her eyes still full of purpose. Samuel stood on a stool beside her, pouring beans into a bowl, his brow furrowed in concentration. Jed took one last look at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear. He rose, slow but steady, and stepped inside. The door closed behind him, and the prairie, wide and eternal, held its breath for just a moment, then exhaled. The story of Jedediah and Clara Carter was never about youth or perfection. It was about what survived. About a love forged not in ease but in endurance. A promise kept, a land claimed, a home built, one heartbeat at a time, and it would live on, in the soil, in the wind, and in the boy who carried both their names. What a journey! Clara and Jed's story was never about perfection. It was about endurance, about choosing love when it's hard, and about the quiet power of building something real. One day, one choice, one scar at a time. In a world that often confuses youth with worth, their story reminds us that dignity, loyalty, and courage are timeless, that healing can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the deepest kind of love is the one that's earned, not given. If this tale touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. What did you feel watching Clara grow from a girl caught in silence into a woman who claimed her place with grace? What stayed with you from Jed's journey, from protector to partner? If you made it to the end of this unforgettable story, leave the word Ridge in the comments. That way, we'll know you were there through every fire, every storm, every heartbeat. If you feel moved and wish to support the creators behind these stories, you can now leave a super thanks right here on YouTube. Any amount, big or small, helps keep this emotional journey alive and allows us to bring even more timeless romances to you. We're deeply grateful. And if you can't support us financially, no worries at all. Just share this video with someone who loves stories of resilience, second chances, and deep, unforgettable love. That too helps more than you know. Ready for more? We've handpicked other stories you might love. Just check the cards we left on the screen. Each one will take you to a new world, full of emotion, drama, and the kind of romance that never fades. Thank you for riding with us across the dusty roads of Ford County. We'll see you in the next chapter.